Mia Torres pressed her back against the cold kitchen wall and counted the bills for the third time. $18. 3 5s and 3 1s, all wrinkled and soft from being handled too many times. She counted again, slower this time, as if patience would somehow multiply the money in her hands. Still 18. $18 wouldn't cover the water bill that was 2 months overdue. It wouldn't touch the property tax notice that had turned from white to yellow to final warning red. It wouldn't fix the hole in the roof where rain was already dripping into a rust-stained bucket in the hallway. Outside, the storm hammered against the house like it had a personal grudge. Wind screamed through the gaps in the window frames. Thunder shook the walls so hard she felt it in her chest. The weather report had called it a once-in-a-decade storm. Of course it would come now. Of course. Mia folded the bills carefully and tucked them into the pocket of her father's old cardigan, the one she wore every night because the heating had been shut off 3 weeks ago. She looked around the kitchen. One drawer hung crooked on broken hinges. The linoleum floor was cracked and peeling. The refrigerator hummed and rattled, working too hard to keep cool a half-gallon of milk, 2 eggs, some wilted lettuce, and half a loaf of bread she'd gotten from the discount bin at the corner market. Her stomach twisted with hunger, but she ignored it. She'd learned how to ignore it. 2 small meals a day. Sometimes 1. She was 23 years old, and she'd gotten very good at being hungry. The single overhead bulb flickered. Once, twice. She held her breath and stared up at it, silently begging. The electric company had sent her a final notice last week. Service disconnection imminent, it said. She'd called them, tried to explain, tried to work out a payment plan. The woman on the phone had been polite but firm. You're already on a payment plan, Miss Torres. You haven't made a payment in 6 weeks. What was she supposed to pay with? Hope? The light bulb steadied. For now. Mia exhaled and sank down at the wobbly kitchen table. The chair creaked under her weight, not because she was heavy, but because everything in this house was falling apart, just like her life. On the table sat a stack of envelopes. She didn't need to open them to know what they said. Past due. Final notice. Legal action pending. The bank wanted their mortgage payment. The city wanted their taxes. The insurance company had already dropped her after she missed 2 premiums. If something happened to this house now, if it burned down, if the roof finally caved in, she'd have nothing. Not that she had much now. Her phone buzzed, the screen lighting up with a notification. Another automated message from the debt collection agency handling her father's medical bills. $22,000. The number was so huge it didn't even feel real anymore. It felt like a joke, like someone else's nightmare that had somehow gotten attached to her name. Her father had died 9 months ago. Cancer, they'd said. But Mia knew it was really poverty that killed him. By the time they caught it, it was too late, too expensive, too far gone. He'd spent his last 6 months in pain, in this house, with Mia trying to care for him with the skills she didn't have and the money she didn't have. When he finally went, she'd felt relief, and then guilt for feeling relieved. He'd left her this house, his legacy. He'd called it on his last lucid day. A rotting 2-bedroom at the edge of the city, where no buses ran and no one visited. The neighborhood had been decent once, 20 years ago. Now it was just forgotten. Mia was 23, and she lived in a ghost town of 1. She'd tried to get a job. She'd tried everything. Waitressing, retail, cleaning offices at night. She'd been hired 3 times and fired 3 times. Once for being late because the bus broke down. Once for not being a good fit. Once for missing a shift, when she'd been too sick to stand. No one wanted to invest in training someone who looked as tired and desperate as she felt. The wind howled, and something metallic clattered across the yard outside, maybe the old trash can, maybe part of the fence finally giving up. Mia didn't get up to check. What was the point? She couldn't fix anything. She couldn't fix any of it. She pulled the cardigan tighter around herself and stared at the $18 on the table. Tomorrow, she'd use 10 of it for the cheapest groceries she could find. Ramen, rice, canned beans. The other 8 she'd save for. What? She didn't even know anymore. There was no plan. There was no way out. There was just today, and then tomorrow, and the slow collapse of everything she had left. The lights flickered again. This time they went out. The refrigerator's hum died. The house plunged into darkness, lit only by the faint glow of streetlights filtering through the rain-streaked windows. Mia sat perfectly still in the blackness and felt nothing. No panic, no tears, just the flat, cold weight of knowing this was her life now. This was all it would ever be. And then boom, boom, boom. 3 massive pounds against the front door, so forceful the entire frame shuddered. Mia's heart slammed against her ribs. No one came to this neighborhood. No one knocked on her door. Not neighbors, not friends, not even delivery drivers who'd long since marked this address as unsafe. She stood slowly, her legs unsteady. Another round of pounding, more desperate this time. Through the window, she could barely make out a shape on her sagging porch, a figure, tall and broad-shouldered, hunched against the storm. Mia's hands shook as she approached the door. Every instinct screamed at her to stay back, to pretend she wasn't home, to hide. But something else, some stupid, human part of her that hadn't died yet, made her reach for the deadbolt. When she pulled the door open, the wind nearly ripped it from her hands. Rain blasted into her face, and standing there, soaked and shaking, was a man she'd never seen before. He was tall, maybe 6 feet, with dark hair plastered to his forehead and a leather jacket that looked expensive, even drenched. His face was bruised, one eye swelling, a cut on his cheekbone, his lips split, but it was his arms that made Mia freeze. Wrapped in them, pressed against his chest and trembling, was a little boy, no older than 5. The child's face was buried in the man's shoulder, small hands gripping the wet leather like his life depended on it. The man's eyes met hers. Dark eyes, desperate eyes, eyes that had seen violence. "We need a place," he said, his voice rough and low. "Just 2 nights, please." He didn't beg. He didn't explain. He just stood there, holding that terrified child, and waited. Mia looked at the boy's small fingers, white-knuckled against his father's jacket. She saw the way the child shook, not from cold, but from pure fear. She'd felt it herself, alone in this house, wondering when everything would finally collapse. Against every instinct of self-preservation, against every warning screaming in her head, Mia stepped aside. "Get in," she said quietly, "before you both freeze to death." The man carried his son across the threshold, and Mia closed the door behind them, shutting out the storm. She didn't know it yet, but she'd just invited something far more dangerous than the rain into her home. She'd opened the door to Frankie Bellini, and nothing would ever be the same. Mia closed the door and locked it, though she wasn't sure what good a flimsy deadbolt would do if these strangers wanted to hurt her. The man stood in her narrow entryway, water pooling at his feet, still holding the boy like he might disappear if he let go. Up close, she could see the details she'd missed in the darkness. The tattoo creeping up his neck, the way his jaw was set tight with tension, the faint smell of smoke and cologne clinging to his wet clothes. "Towels," she said, more to herself than to him. She hurried to the bathroom and pulled out the only 2 she owned, both thin and fraying at the edges, but clean. When she returned, the man had moved to the window, peering through a gap in the curtains at the street outside. He didn't turn when she approached. "Here," Mia said softly. He glanced back, nodded once, and took the towels with his free hand. She watched as he gently wrapped one around the boy, who still hadn't made a sound. The child's eyes were wide and glassy, staring at nothing. "I have blankets," she offered. "Not many, but—" She didn't finish. She went to the narrow closet in the hallway and pulled out her only spare blanket, the wool one with moth holes that had been her grandmother's. She brought it back and draped it over the sagging couch. "You can sit. Dry off." The man finally set the boy down on the couch and wrapped him in the blanket. The child curled into himself immediately, small and silent. Frankie, though she didn't know his name, yet stood and moved back to the window. His eyes swept the street, left to right, like he was searching for something specific, or someone. That's when Mia noticed the watch. Even in the dim light, it gleamed silver, heavy, the kind of thing that cost more than her entire house. His boots, too, were quality leather, barely scuffed despite the rain. And when he pulled a phone from his jacket pocket, the screen was cracked like a spider web, but the device itself looked new, expensive. He stared at it for a moment, then, with deliberate precision, pried the back off and pulled out the battery. He set both pieces on the windowsill and turned to scan the room again, his gaze finally landing on her. "Thank you," he said. His voice was quiet but carried weight, like he didn't say those words often. Mia nodded and turned toward the kitchen. Her hands shook as she opened the cabinet. 2 sleeves of crackers and a small carton of milk she'd been rationing. Her breakfast for Thursday and Friday, maybe Saturday if she stretched it. She poured the milk into her only clean mug, heated it on the stove with the last working burner, and brought it to the boy with a handful of crackers on a chipped plate. The child looked up at her with those wide, haunted eyes, then took the mug in both hands. He sipped slowly, and Mia saw his shoulders relax just a fraction. She crouched beside the couch and set the plate down. "It's okay," she whispered. "You're safe here." The man watched her from across the room, his expression unreadable. Outside, the storm raged on. Mia woke to silence. The storm had quieted to a steady drumming against the roof, and the house had settled into its usual creaks and groans. She'd given the man and his son her bedroom, the only room with a door that locked from the inside, and made herself a nest of coats on the living room floor. It wasn't comfortable, but she'd slept in worse conditions. She checked the time on her phone, 2:17 in the morning. Something had pulled her from sleep, though she couldn't say what. Then she heard it, a soft, uneven breathing from the couch. She sat up slowly and saw the boy sitting upright in the darkness, the blanket pooled around his waist. He wasn't crying. He wasn't moving. He was just staring at the far wall, his small hands folded in his lap. Mia pushed herself up and crossed the room quietly. "Hey," she whispered. "Can't sleep?" The boy didn't answer, didn't even look at her. She lowered herself onto the couch beside him, careful to leave space between them. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Outside, the rain continued its endless percussion. "This house is old," Mia said finally, her voice barely above a murmur. "It makes all kinds of noises at night. Used to scare me when I was little. I thought there were ghosts in the walls." She smiled faintly, though he wasn't looking. "My dad told me it was just the wood settling. Old houses do that. They talk to themselves." The boy's breathing steadied slightly. She kept going, filling the silence with soft, meaningless words. She told him about the stray cat that used to come around, the orange one with the torn ear who'd sit on the porch and wait for scraps. She told him about the leaky roof, about how she had to move the bucket every time the wind changed direction. She talked about nothing important, nothing scary, just the small rhythms of a broken-down life. Slowly, so slowly she almost didn't notice the boy lean toward her, his small shoulder pressed against her arm, then his head tilted until it rested against her side. Mia froze, afraid to move and break whatever fragile trust this was. She felt his weight, solid and warm, and the tightness in her chest eased just a little. She glanced up and saw him. The man, standing in the doorway of the bedroom, half in shadow. His arms were crossed, his expression unreadable in the dim light, but he didn't move, didn't speak. He just watched as his son finally relaxed against a stranger who'd given them shelter from the storm. Morning light filtered through the dirty windows, grey and weak. Mia woke to find the boy still asleep on the couch, curled under the blanket like a question mark. She moved carefully to the kitchen, her joints stiff from sleeping on the floor, and started the coffee maker with the last of her grounds. The machine sputtered and hissed, filling the silence with something almost normal. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to find the man standing in the kitchen doorway. In daylight, he looked different, older, more tired. The bruises on his face had darkened overnight, purple and yellow blooming across his cheekbone. But his eyes were alert, scanning the room like he'd already catalogued every exit. "Coffee?" Mia offered. He nodded and moved closer. She poured 2 cups, both chipped, and slid one across the counter to him. He took it without thanks, wrapping both hands around the mug like he needed the warmth. They stood in silence for a moment, 2 strangers drinking bad coffee in a kitchen that smelled like mildew and desperation. "Business went wrong," he said finally, his voice rough from sleep. "Can't trust anyone right now." Mia didn't ask for more. She'd learned a long time ago that some questions were better left unspoken. She just nodded and sipped her coffee, black and bitter. He reached for the sugar bowl on the counter, and that's when she saw it. The gun, tucked into his waistband at the small of his back, the black metal stark against his white shirt. Her breath caught. He noticed immediately, following her gaze, and his hand stilled. "You afraid?" he asked, turning to face her fully. His eyes locked onto hers, steady and measuring. Mia set her cup down carefully. Her heart was hammering, but she kept her voice level. "I've been afraid my whole life," she said. "Afraid of losing this house, afraid of starving, afraid of ending up on the street with nowhere to go." She met his gaze without flinching. "You're just a different kind of scary." Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but close. He picked up his coffee again and took a long drink. "Fair enough," he said quietly. Outside, a car passed slowly down the street. He moved back to the window instantly, watching until it disappeared. When he turned back, the brief moment of understanding was gone, replaced by the tense vigilance of a man at war. Mia had left just after noon with 8 of her remaining dollars, promising to be back in 20 minutes. The corner store was 4 blocks away, the only place within walking distance that sold anything edible. She'd bought a loaf of day-old bread, a jar of peanut butter, and a bruised apple for the boy. The cashier had given her a pitying look she'd pretended not to notice. When she pushed open the front door, plastic bag in hand, she knew immediately something had changed. The air felt different, charged, dangerous. Frankie stood at the living room window, his body coiled tight, one hand gripping the edge of the broken blinds. The boy sat on the couch exactly where she'd left him, but now his eyes were wider, more alert. "What happened?" Mia asked quietly, setting the bag on the kitchen counter. "Car," Frankie said without turning. "Black sedan. Passed 3 times in the last 15 minutes, slowing down each time." His jaw worked. "They're looking." Mia's stomach dropped. She moved to the window beside him and peered out. The street was empty now, just wet pavement and a few parked cars that had been there for days. Everything looked normal. Everything looked wrong. "They found us," Frankie said, more to himself than to her. He finally turned, his dark eyes meeting hers. "You need to pack. Anything important. We might have to move fast." Pack. The word hung in the air like a foreign concept. Mia looked around her house, the sagging furniture, the water-stained walls, the kitchen with its broken cabinet. What did she own that was worth saving? She walked slowly to her bedroom, Frankie watching her from the doorway. She opened the closet, pushed past the few clothes hanging there, and reached for the shoebox on the top shelf. Inside was a single photograph in a dollar store frame. Her parents, on their wedding day, young and smiling, standing in front of a church she couldn't remember, her father's arm around her mother's waist. Both of them gone now. She held it for a moment, then tucked it under her arm. That was it. 23 years of life, and this was all she had worth keeping. When she came back to the living room, Frankie was staring at her, at the single photograph in her hands. His expression shifted something that might have been recognition, or pity, or understanding. He looked around the room again. Really looked this time, at the poverty she lived in, the emptiness of it all. "That's it?" he asked quietly. Mia nodded. "That's it." He was silent for a long moment, then turned back to the window. "Get the boy ready," he said, his voice harder now. "If that car comes back, we're gone." Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance. The storm wasn't over yet. The black sedan didn't come back. Not in the next hour. Not by sunset. But the tension in the house remained. Thick and suffocating. Frankie paced the living room like a caged animal, checking the windows every few minutes, his hand never far from the gun at his waist. The boy had fallen asleep on the couch again, exhausted by fear he was too young to understand. As darkness settled over the neighborhood, Frankie finally stopped pacing. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a thick fold of bills, bound with a rubber band. Mia watched from the kitchen doorway as he counted out 20s, 50s, hundreds more money than she'd seen in years. He separated a stack and held it out to her. 2,000, he said. Take it. Get a hotel somewhere, far from here. Downtown. Across the river. I don't care. Just go. Tonight. Mia stared at the money in his hand. $2,000. It would cover her mortgage for 2 months, pay the electric bill, buy real food. It would buy her time, precious, desperate time. Her fingers twitched, wanting to reach for it, wanting to take it and run. But she didn't move. Why? She asked. Because they're coming, Frankie said bluntly. Maybe tonight, maybe tomorrow. When they do, anyone in this house is a problem to solve. You don't need to be here for that. Where would I go? The question came out quieter than she intended. She looked around her broken kitchen, at the house that was falling apart but was still hers. This is all I have. I don't have friends with spare rooms. I don't have family who'll take me in. If I leave, I'm just nowhere. She met his eyes. If they're coming, I'd rather know than hide and wonder when it'll catch up to me anyway. Frankie's jaw tightened. You don't know what you're saying. These aren't people who knock politely. I know, Mia said. I saw your face when you got here. I saw the gun. I'm not stupid. She crossed her arms, holding herself steady. But this is my house. It might not be much, but it's mine. And that's your son on my couch. If I run and something happens to him because I wasn't here to help. I couldn't live with that. For a long moment, Frankie just stared at her, really looked at her, like he was seeing something he hadn't expected. The desperate girl in the falling-apart house who had nothing but refused to abandon a child she'd just met. Something in his expression softened, just slightly a crack in the armor. He lowered the money and tucked it back into his jacket. You're either very brave or very stupid, he said. Probably both, Mia replied. Frankie almost smiled. Almost. He nodded once, slowly, with something that looked like respect. All right, he said. Then we stay ready. The attack came at 7:43 on the second night, just as the last light bled from the sky. Mia was in the kitchen washing the dinner dishes, 3 plates, 3 forks, the simple ritual of pretending everything was normal. The boy sat at the table, coloring on the back of an old envelope with a pencil stub. Frankie stood at his usual post by the window, vigilant as ever. Then his whole body went rigid. Mia, he said, his voice deadly calm. Come here. Now. She dried her hands and crossed to him. He pointed through the blinds without touching them. 2 cars, black and sleek, rolling slowly down the street with their headlights off. They stopped 3 houses away, engines still running. How many exits does this house have? Frankie asked, his hand already on his gun. Front door, back door off the kitchen, window in my bedroom. But the car doors opened. 6 men stepped out, moving with practiced efficiency. Even in the darkness, Mia could see they wore dark clothes and carried something that caught the streetlight's gleam. Guns. They were carrying guns. Go, Frankie said, his voice sharp as a blade. He moved away from the window and scooped his son up from the table in one fluid motion. The boy's eyes went wide, the pencil falling from his fingers. Frankie pressed him into Mia's arms, the child's small body trembling against her chest. The closet in your bedroom. Take him there and don't come out. You hear me? Don't come out. But go. The first gunshot shattered the living room window before she could respond. Glass exploded inward, and Mia's scream caught in her throat. She turned and ran. The boy clutched tight against her, his face buried in her shoulder. Behind her, she heard Frankie shouting something, heard his footsteps moving fast, heard the terrible percussion of more gunfire tearing through her house. She burst into her bedroom and slammed the door. Her hands shook so badly she could barely turn the flimsy lock. The boy was making small, gasping sounds, not quite crying, just breathing in short, panicked bursts. She stumbled to the closet, yanked it open, and shoved inside, pulling the boy down with her. They huddled in the darkness among her few hanging clothes, and Mia wrapped both arms around him, holding him as tight as she dared. More gunfire. Closer now. The sound of heavy boots on her floor. Men's voices shouting commands she couldn't understand over the ringing in her ears. Something crashed, furniture overturning, glass breaking. The boy pressed his face into her chest, and Mia realized she was shaking as badly as he was. She put her hand over his mouth, gentle but firm, and held him close. In the darkness of the closet, surrounded by the sounds of violence, she prayed to a God she'd stopped believing in years ago. The gunfire stopped. That was somehow worse than the noise. In the sudden quiet, Mia could hear everything. Her own ragged breathing, the boy's muffled whimpers against her palm, the creak of floorboards as someone moved through her house, heavy footsteps, multiple sets, men searching. She heard voices, low and clipped. Professional. Clear the kitchen. Check the back. Upstairs. No, upstairs. Just bedrooms. The boy trembled violently in her arms. Mia tightened her grip, her hand still pressed gently over his mouth. She could feel his hot tears on her fingers. Her own heart hammered so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. Footsteps in the hallway, getting closer. She squeezed her eyes shut and prayed they'd miss the bedroom, that they'd assume it was empty, that somehow the door exploded inward with a crash that made her jump. The flimsy lock splintered, and she heard boots on the bedroom floor. Heavy, deliberate. Someone was searching. Anything? A voice called from somewhere beyond. Checking now. The closet door was next. It had to be. Mia's mind raced, animal panic flooding every thought. Then, through the terror, a memory surfaced. Her father, years ago, showing her something. In case you ever need to hide, he'd said. She'd been maybe 12, and she hadn't understood why she'd need to hide in her own house. But he'd shown her anyway. The false panel, back of the closet, behind the winter coats she never wore. Mia moved fast. She pushed the hanging clothes aside with one hand, still holding the boy with the other, and felt along the back wall. Her fingers found the seam, the barely visible outline her father had cut into the plywood decades ago. She pressed hard, and the panel shifted inward with a groan that sounded deafening in the silence. The bedroom door creaked. Footsteps right outside the closet. Mia shoved the boy through the opening first, then squeezed herself after him. The crawl space was narrow and dark, smelling of rot and old wood and something dead. She pulled the panel closed behind her just as the closet door swung open. Light spilled in through the cracks. She could see the beam of a flashlight sweeping across the clothes. The boy was shaking so hard she thought he might come apart. Mia wrapped herself around him, making her body a shield, her hand back over his mouth. She pressed her lips close to his ear. Shh, she breathed, barely a sound. Don't move, don't breathe. On the other side of the panel, she heard hangers scraping against the rod. The man was checking, pushing clothes aside. Any second now he'd see the panel. Any second now he'd know. The flashlight beam found the seam. Mia saw it through the crack, a thin line of light tracing the edge of the false panel. The man on the other side went silent. Then she heard it. The soft tap of knuckles against wood. Hollow. He knew. Got something, the man called out. Mia's hand closed around something in the darkness beside her, a piece of metal, cold and rough. She gripped it tight and realized it was a section of old pipe, rusted and broken at one end. her father's forgotten attempts to fix the plumbing. It was barely 2 feet long, but it was all she had. The panel scraped open. The beam of the flashlight blinded her. A man's face appeared in the opening angular, scarred, eyes cold as winter. He started crawling through. Gun first. Mia didn't think. She swung the pipe with everything she had. It connected with his temple with a sickening crack. The man grunted, his head snapping sideways, but he didn't go down. His hand shot out and grabbed her wrist, squeezing until her bones ground together. She gasped in pain but didn't let go of the pipe. The boy screamed behind her, high and terrified. The man dragged himself further into the crawl space, his gun coming up. Mia kicked at him wildly, her foot connecting with his jaw. He cursed, his grip loosening just enough. She twisted free and swung again, desperate, sobbing. Mia. Frankie's voice, roaring from somewhere beyond. The man's head turned toward the sound. That half-second of distraction was enough. Mia brought the pipe down on his gun hand. He dropped the weapon with a snarl. Then 3 gunshots, sharp and final, echoing through the house. The man in front of her jerked, his eyes going wide. Blood bloomed across his back. He slumped forward, blocking the opening, and went still. Silence. Heavy and complete. Mia! Frankie's voice again, closer now, desperate. Mia, answer me. She couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. The boy was sobbing openly now, his small body shaking against hers. Then the dead man was being dragged backward, pulled through the opening, and there was Frankie's face, bruised and bloody, his eyes wild until they found hers. "It's over," he said, his voice rough. "Come out. It's over." His hand reached through the darkness, steady and sure. Mia took it. Dawn came slowly, bleeding pale light through the shattered windows. Mia sat on what remained of her couch, the boy asleep in her lap, his fingers still clutching her shirt. Frankie stood by the window, his gun finally holstered, his white shirt dark with blood, some his, some not. 4 bodies lay in her living room, covered with sheets he'd found in her closet. She tried not to look at them. The sound of engines made her flinch. Frankie didn't. He just watched through the broken blinds as a convoy of black SUVs rolled down the street, 5 of them, moving in formation. They stopped in front of her house, and men emerged. 12 at least, all dressed in dark suits, all armed, all moving with military precision. "Your people?" Mia asked quietly, careful not to wake the boy. Frankie nodded. "My people." The front door was already broken, hanging off one hinge. The men entered without knocking. The first through was older, maybe 50, with silver hair and a scar running down his jaw. When he saw Frankie, he stopped. Then, slowly, deliberately, he dropped to one knee, his head bowed. "Don Bellini," he said. The others followed suit, a wave of loyalty and respect. Mia stared. Don. She'd heard the word before, in movies, in stories. She understood what it meant. Frankie moved forward and pulled the older man to his feet. "Marco, the Rossi family is handled, permanently. You're clear to return." Frankie nodded, then turned as his son stirred awake. The boy's eyes opened, saw his father, and he scrambled out of Mia's lap and ran. Frankie caught him, lifting him up, holding him close. For a moment, the dangerous man disappeared, and there was just a father relieved his child was alive. Then Frankie's eyes found Mia. She stood slowly, suddenly aware of how she must look covered in dust and blood, her clothes torn, her hair wild. She stood in the ruins of her house, and for the first time, she saw it clearly. The broken furniture, the bullet holes in the walls, the death that had visited her doorstep. Frankie walked toward her, his son on his hip, and extended his free hand. "You saved my son," he said. "You could have run when I offered you money, could have sold us out for a reward, could have locked yourself in that crawl space and left him to die. But you fought." His dark eyes held hers. "That means something to me." He gestured toward the lead SUV outside. That house is kindling. You're done suffering here. Mia looked around one last time, at the poverty that had suffocated her, at the loneliness that had been her only companion, at the slow death of hope that she'd accepted as her fate. Then she looked at the photograph of her parents on the floor, the frame cracked but intact. She picked it up, tucked it under her arm, and placed her hand in Frankie's. "Okay," she whispered. As the convoy pulled away, Mia watched through the tinted window as two of Frankie's men placed orange markers around her property. Demolition tags. The house that had been her prison would become rubble, and the girl who'd thought she was invisible, forgotten, worthless, destined for nothing had finally been seen.